come at last to the final video in this series, where I'll be taking a look at the remaining figures that were released in this line. So to start us off, I have the Red Skull. As ever, we have that fantastic illustrated portrait of the character, in this case the Red Skull looking pretty angry there, which is pretty consistent with the character, which I think is great. And then in the top left corner we have the Cosmic Cube looking very vibrant and colourful, which is very attractive. I think they've done a very nice job of this. Then of course in the lower left corner we have the famous cover, which is Captain America 115. There's certainly been no shortage of famous Red Skull covers on comic books across the years, but I do think that this is one of the most striking and memorable covers he's ever graced, so I do think this is a really solid choice. Meanwhile, the reverse of the packaging is fairly clean. We have that one image there of the Red Skull in a sort of slightly squatted position, which looks a little bit strange now that I think about it, but nevertheless is pretty fun. And then of course we have that wonderful gatefold cover which opens up, and we have those illustrations on the left hand side, the bio about the character, and quite a lengthy bio dedicated to the Red Skull here, which is pretty cool. And then on the right hand side we have the window display, and of course we can see the figure in all his glory there. Now, the first thing I noticed about this figure when I opened him up is that he's not wearing the costume that's on the famous cover or on the various illustrations on the packaging. The costume is mostly right, but it's the wrong colour, it's too dark, and he's not wearing gloves. That said, he does have the cravat, it's just very subtly hidden. It's not really fluffy enough to really stick out of his collar and make it obvious that's what it is, but it is there. And I think this head sculpt is absolutely brilliant. I think they've really nailed this. This looks fantastic, very ferocious, very angry. And I think they've done quite a nice job accentuating that mould with the paint as well. Those dark highlights under the eyes and around the mouth there really set this off and make it look really quite fearsome. So I think they've done a very good job here. As I said, the main costume itself just feels a little bit too dark. It's too much of a khaki colour rather than a brighter green as we see in the comic books, which is a shame. And you'll notice he has a white faux leather cummerbund, which suffers due to the stitching going in and out and around. It looks a little bit clumsy. As I mentioned previously, it's a shame that they haven't given him the white hands. If they just painted these hands white, then they would have resembled the gloves that we see in the comic book, so it's kind of a shame they didn't opt for that. Also, you'll notice they've given him the armband, but without the SWAT sticker on it. Now, I'm assuming they deemed that to be a little bit insensitive, so they decided to remove that, which I can understand, but I think they probably would have been better just removing the entire armband, because it looks a little bit silly without it. And then finally, he does have those big clunky brown rubber shoes. And to be fair, the figure just about gets away with them. We've seen obviously what happens when they utilise big rubber boots, which looks really silly and makes the whole figure look out of proportion. Here though, it doesn't look so bad. It is quite subtle and it gets away with it. In terms of articulation, well, he does have the standard swivel at the neck, so of course he can spin his head from side to side and right the way around if you want him to. He's also got ball joints in the shoulders, so of course the arms really kick up and out, and they can go all the way back there and all the way up, which is fantastic. And then he also has a single joint at the elbow, so he can bend his arm to roughly 90 degrees, which is great. There's a pin swivel at the wrist, so the hand can rotate 360 degrees, and of course it hinges all the way forwards and backwards as well. There's another ball joint in the waist, so he can move from side to side, he can lean from side to side, and he can bend forwards and backwards a little bit as well, which is pretty cool. He's also got a ball joint in the hips, so the legs can kick out to the side, they can kick forwards, they can kick backwards, and there is a single joint at the knee, again bending the lower leg to about 90 degrees. And then there is another pin swivel at the ankle, allowing the foot to hinge forwards and backwards and move from side to side. Next up, we have the man without fear himself, Daredevil. Again, I think this is a pretty striking box art that we see here, and for the famous cover, they've gone with issue number 7. Again, I think you're spoiled for choice when it comes to great Daredevil covers across the years, and it's difficult to argue which is the most famous, but certainly this is a very famous cover from very early on in Daredevil's run with the red costume, so I think this is definitely eligible. Sadly, the reverse of the packaging is just an advert for that mail-away exclusive Aunt May figure, so I won't comment any more on that. And the interior fold is beautiful as always. Really nice images there, lovely bit of bio, and then that fantastic window display. And they've got Daredevil in a pretty cool action pose in the box there, so he looks very presentable. Being totally honest, this figure is a little bit of a head scratcher. There's some elements of it that are really well done and very nice, and then there's other things that really let it down. First off, they've chosen to give him an open mouth yelling expression in the head sculpt. I'm not a big fan of this, it very rarely works. There's a few notable exceptions, but this one doesn't really work for me, I've got to be honest. It limits the amount of positions and display options that you have to be able to put him in. Now, the tailoring on the main body stocking of the costume looks absolutely fantastic. They've chosen a really pitch perfect shade of red. This looks absolutely spot on. It's made of that very nice lycra material, so it's quite nice to the touch in terms of its texture, but it also catches the light quite nicely, and it looks really authentic to what we see in the source material. The double D emblem that has been sewn into his chest, when it's brand new, looks pretty good. It's made of a faux leather, and it's pretty effective. Obviously, over time, due to wear, this can flake off and start to look a little bit worn, as mine does here. And you'll probably notice they've opted to give him a plastic belt, which is a different shade of red, so it stands out a little bit. It's not that bad in truth. And just off it, you'll see there's a faux leather pouch for him to store his billy club. And this is nicely secured with a red elastic band around his thigh. This looks pretty good. And speaking of the billy club, here is a picture of what it looks like when it's assembled. It comes in 2 separate pieces and it just clicks together. It looks pretty good. It's a little bit small for my liking, but this is fairly accurate depending on which comic book you're reading, so it's fine. It would have been nice if it had a curve on the end of it, but it certainly does the job, and it's nice that they included this. Now, there's no avoiding talking about the gloves. I'm not quite sure why ToyBiz decided to experiment and take this approach with Daredevil, because clearly these gloves don't work. They're a faux leather that have been very poorly sewn together, and they just look clunky as anything. They don't really function as gloves, they just look like giant mittens on his hands, which obviously being made of faux leather, over time they also wear away and become quite chipped and flaky, as you can see with mine. But even at their best, they look strange, and to be honest, I don't understand why they didn't just paint his hands red as they did with the Red Skull, and it would have looked pretty good. And then to make matters worse, they've also saddled him with those giant clunky rubber boots, which, as you probably know by now, I'm not a big fan of, and it just makes the figure look slightly ridiculous, out of proportion, and a little bit silly. And again, we've seen other figures that have been released where they've taken a very different approach that's worked much better. I don't understand why they didn't do that here. Sadly, I feel that Daredevil could have been one of the best figures in the line. He's just been sabotaged by too many elements that just undermine him. Next up, we have the Hulk, and I have to say I really love the illustration on the front of this packaging. The Hulk's expression there is perfect. I absolutely love it. It's just so full of menace and anger. It's beautifully painted, and I really like that we can see the gamma bomb explosion behind him there as well. It's really colourful and vibrant and just captures the spirit of the character. For the famous cover, they've opted for the Incredible Hulk number 116. Now, of course, over the years, we've had no shortage of amazing and very memorable Incredible Hulk covers. I'm not sure I would have personally opted for this one, especially when we have such famous ones, such as the giant-size Incredible Hulk by Jim Steranko. It's worth pointing out that the Hulk is actually an oversized figure, so the packaging is much thicker, and is comparable in width to the Scarlet Witch box that we saw in a recent video. Once again, the gatefold is absolutely gorgeous. We have those illustrations of the Hulk, the bio, and of course the window display. It looks brilliant, and you can put this on display and it'll look absolutely fantastic. So the first thing you'll notice about the figure when you liberate him from the packaging is that he is oversized. He's the biggest figure in this entire collection, and that is entirely appropriate. Overall, I really love this figure, but the one thing that I have to acknowledge that really lets it down is the head sculpt. This hasn't quite worked out the way it should have done. Something about these proportions are just a little bit off, and it just looks a little bit too cartoonish and a little bit too childish. Sadly, the head just looks a little bit too small for this body. It needed to be scaled up just a little bit more. There's nothing wrong with the expression, but there's something about the proportions of the eyes to the nose to the mouth that just don't look quite right, and it looks a bit cartoonish and a little bit, like I said, a bit childish almost. That being said, it is really cool to see a brand new sculpt. Virtually everything on this figure is new because it's much bigger than any of the other figures in the line. Now, they have opted to give him some extra articulation as well. However, I feel like this might have been a misstep really, because it does compromise the aesthetic, because he has that unhealthy ridge in the centre of his chest there, which looks a little bit distracting. Ultimately, I don't feel like this extra articulation really gives you that much more anyway. You already have that ball joint at the lower waist there, so he can move from side to side. I suppose it gives you a little bit more leniency for being able to lean from side to side a little bit more and bend forward and backwards a bit more than other figures in the line, but I don't know if it's really strictly necessary in truth. He also has brand new arms and hands, of course, and I have to say I really like this giant open hand. Like, it really emphasises just how much bigger this figure is, and he can just about grab other figures in the line, which is pretty cool. His purple cloth pants are very nicely tailored. They look like they've just been savaged and burst open, ripped open, which there looks really cool. And I particularly like how they've got a little hole there for his kneecap to just poke through, and it just fits perfectly, and it looks really good. And the other thing I have to commend this figure for is the colouring of it, because the green is so vibrant and bright, and so is the purple. It looks really attractive and very colourful and fun. To show off his scale, I thought it would be good to put him next to Thor, who's one of the other big characters in the line. As you can see, he's just fractionally taller and just fractionally broader and bigger than Thor there, which again is pretty accurate to what we see in the comic books. That's the way it should be, and it looks pretty good all in all, and it just shows off the sheer size and power of this figure. So definitely one for the collection. It looks really, really good. I personally really love this figure. It's a little bit disappointing about the head sculpt. It's the only thing that really lets it down. Other than that, I do think it's one of the best in the line, and certainly one of the most fun. But that's not quite the end of the story, because there is one last character that I don't own, which I wasn't able to cover before, and that is the Falcon. This seemed like a pretty unusual choice for a release at the time, because the Falcon kind of had his heyday back in the 70s, and of course he's very, very popular again now, and he's obviously been reinvigorated in the Marvel Cinematic Universe and in the comic books as well. But during this time in the 90s, he kind of fallen by the wayside a little bit, and he wasn't one of the premier characters or A-list characters that he is today. The famous cover, interestingly, that they opted for is from his limited series issue number 1, and it is a really striking cover, but I have to say I'd never seen it before until I saw this figure, so I'm not sure if that qualifies as being a famous cover versus all the famous ones where he's partnered with Captain America, of course. It's always difficult to judge from photos, but I think I can make a pretty fair assessment based on the other figures in the line. They've obviously given him one of the bigger body sculpts similar to Thor or Captain America, and I don't feel that really works for this character. I think he would have benefited from having one of the smaller frames like Spider-Man or Mr. Fantastic. As it is, it looks slightly out of proportion, looks a little bit silly in that chest area, and it would have benefited from having a smaller frame, particularly there. He also has the wings, which is a nice touch, and you can see that they're held together with elastic bands there, and this looks pretty good, I have to say. When the wings are out of full spread there, this looks pretty cool and pretty fun, so I think this would be quite displayable and be quite nice if you partner him with Captain America. They'd make quite a nice looking team. So there you go. Over the course of 11 videos, I've been taking a look at all of the figures released as part of ToyBiz's Marvel Famous Covers line. This was clearly a pretty successful line for ToyBiz, producing dozens and dozens of characters and really committing to experimenting with form and style as they went along. Certainly there were quite a few lows, there were definite highs, and then there was a lot of things in between, things that just needed a little bit of tweaking here and there. But all in all, I think it's a really lovely set. Even by today's standards, this is a really fun line of 8-inch action figures. If I just had one wish though, it would be that they'd managed to fill out the rest of the remaining missing characters. There's certain rosters that feel somewhat incomplete, and it would have been nice to have had more Spider-Man villains. It would have been nice to have seen a complete lineup of the Fantastic Four. But sadly, it wasn't meant to be. But this isn't the end of the story, because when Hasbro acquired the Marvel license in the early 2000s, they also launched their own 8-inch scale line, which came under two headings. There was the Spider-Man Signature Series, and then ultimately there was the Marvel Legends Signature Series. These figures utilised all new body molds, and to a large degree are fairly incompatible with your ToyBiz collection, at least in terms of aesthetic and design. And for the most part, they would re-release characters that had already been released as part of the Marvel Famous Covers line. However, they did produce some brand new characters, such as Dr. Octopus and Sandman. And whilst they weren't made to be compatible with the Marvel Famous Covers line, you can sneak them in there on your display, and it looks pretty good. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.